Good afternoon, welcome to another A-Push video with Mr. Pate for Barlow High School. Today we're looking at the Antebellum South. Antebellum is a term that means pre-war or before the war, and in this case, of course, the war we're talking about is a civil war. So when you hear Antebellum America, it means pre-Civil War America. When you hear Antebellum South, like in this case, it means the pre-Civil War South. Generally, that time period refers to 1800 to 1860. All right, the pre-cotton gin South. The South of the late 1700s, you essentially had a couple of very valuable crops that are being grown, tobacco in places, and then you had rice, which only could be grown in coastal areas of South Carolina, and then you had some specific fairly coastal areas that long staple cotton could be grown. And this was a favorite kind of cotton because the fibers were preferred by manufacturers in factories, both in New England and Europe, but it was also something that, the seeds were easily removed, so it was not a labor-intensive crop. But the problem was, climate-wise, this could only be grown in a very small area of the deep south coast. It was not something that could be grown everywhere. So cotton proponents and people in the South who were, big defenders of slavery, they really saw slavery would eventually die out, as it already died out in the North. The North did not have slavery. It had it in pockets once upon a time, but not anymore. So they viewed that as something that would, in the long term, just go away. Well, post-cotton gin, which the cotton gin is going to be invented in 1793, the post-cotton gin South, everything changes. The second kind of cotton that was, remember I said long staple cotton was the preferred one, but it was very fragile and could only be grown in a very specific climate area. There's a more robust kind of cotton that could be grown all over the place, and this type of cotton is called short staple cotton. The problem with short staple cotton is that the seeds are all mixed in the middle. So it's very labor intensive because to make it work you have to pick every single seed out. Well, what does this end up being? This ends up being slaves picking it out by hand, taking a very, very long time. So this limits, based on how many slaves a person had as a southern slave-owning cotton producer, how much could they actually produce and actually go through and remove the seeds and have cleaned out to be sold. It was a very limited amount. Very valuable if you could do it, but that's why the other form was very preferred. But after they get to Eli Whitney's cotton gin, which is a machine that basically goes through and just pulls out the seeds, it made cotton production 50 times more efficient at basically the processing of the cotton after it had been picked. 50 times. So what are the implications of this 50 times increase? Essentially, cotton is going to sweep across the South. Anywhere that short staple cotton can be grown, it will. Cotton demand, both in New England and Europe, was exploding. People wanted more and more of it for reasons you can understand today. People generally prefer cotton to wool. It's more comfortable. And they were able to grow a lot of cotton, and really cotton production hadn't taken hold in many other areas to the extent that it now was beginning to in the South. And it really is going to make a big difference, allowing the South to kind of get at the front of the line in terms of cotton production. So there's heavy demand, huge profits to be made, and now the implications are that the more land you get and the more slaves you have, the more money you can make. So you really start to see the growth of what people would call kind of these cotton kingdoms or these massive plantations. Instead of having smaller amounts of acreage, now you're talking about thousands and thousands of acres. Okay? And so when we're looking at this really reinvigorates slavery and makes the South highly dependent on cotton production and slavery as time goes forward. So that's essentially what's happened to the cotton gin. And it's going to become an interesting thing as we see how Southern society develops because of this. So our next topic is the three Souths. Really, as I've colored them here, you have three different layers of the South, and they have a different commitment to cotton and a different commitment to slavery. So let's go ahead and look. In the upper South, which are the blue states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware, you have a diverse economy. I guess it's in Virginia, so it'd be in the middle, but right up here you have the Tredegar Iron Works. So you had slaves working in a manufacturing iron facility, before too long. But you had kind of in the southern portion of these states, the climate was still conducive to some cotton growth, but you might have livestock or all kinds of grains being produced also as food. So your commitment to slavery is going to be less. On average, the upper South states had 17% of their population was slave. So far less slaves, although a significant percentage, and far less cotton production. They're going to be more diversified with a variety of things, a little manufacturing, a little food production, a little cotton, a bunch of different stuff. The Middle South, represented by the green, the Middle South is going to actually be Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia. And these states are 30% slave, and so they have a greater commitment. They're going to be having more cotton production, although they'll have some other things, like I mentioned, the Tredegar Iron Works in Virginia. They'll have a little more diversity, but a lot more cotton production and a lot more slaves, and a lot higher commitment to slavery. The Deep South is a completely cotton economy, and it is 47% slave. South Carolina is actually, for a period of time in the antebellum period, going to have more slaves than it has white people. So a massive amount of slaves in these states. This is called the Cotton Belt. It's all cotton production basically in this area. And essentially, the commitment's going to be deepest here. Now, if you keep this in mind going forward, we're not at the Civil War yet, but when we get there, which states are going to secede first? You shouldn't need a very long time to figure out. The red states, the Deep South, with the highest commitment to cotton and to slavery, are going to be the ones that are out first. And then eventually the green states, they all secede as well. And then the states with the lowest commitment, they all end up staying in the Union. So that's something to keep in mind. The South is not just one size fits all, everybody was the same in their feeling. So in one way you can see that geographically, due to climate and other factors, you had some things going on that made different parts of the South different. They're not all the same, they're not clones. But you also have different levels of Southern society, okay? And I guess at this point, I didn't go over our essential question at the beginning, so that's my bad. The essential question was, how did the cotton gin reinvigorate slavery? I think we've already answered that. Clearly, it's going to make the production of cotton vastly more efficient, and when it does that, it increases the commitment to slavery and the spread of slavery and the demand for slaves massively as cotton becomes so valuable. But the levels of Southern society, it's important to remember that less than 25% of all white families own slaves. Okay, but there's a commitment of almost all whites in the South to having slaves, and we'll explain that dynamic here in a second. The first group we have is the planter class. They are on top. You're really only talking about 1,700 plus families. They all have greater than or equal to 20 slaves. Most of them were going to be between 50 and the hundreds of slaves. Okay, I wrote down here Southern rock stars because they are going to be viewed as kind of these legendary, amazing leaders of society. They absolutely rule political leadership in the states, and they also were the social leaders in all of the areas that they lived. This planter class, these people were economically, socially, and politically at the head of the table, and they are seen with awe and kind of the dream. It's a disgusting, sick dream, but the dream at the time, having a slave equaled prosperity. Generally, you got a 10% profit return every year on what you paid for your slave is how much you'd make. So if you kept your slave for more than 10 years, it would be very profitable to you. The slaves, also were seen as kind of a status symbol that, ooh, you're cool enough to own slaves. That's kind of how it was viewed. So you have, and of course, it represented that you were rich. So for a variety of reasons, having slaves, it was one of the best investments Southerners were making in terms of money they could get back. It allowed them to have these cotton plantations here in the Deep South, and it also, of course, was seen as kind of as a status symbol. So the planters, they rule Southern society. but you're not talking about very many families. You're talking about very few families. And one of the weird things, they're going to be very supported by the white majority, mostly poor whites. Now, there are some people who own a few slaves, maybe a couple of slaves, and had a bigger family farm, and were kind of self-sufficient and maybe sold a little bit away. But not a lot. There are a ton of poor whites who they are going to not benefit in any way from the institution of slavery. And one of the reasons for this is the planter class, they try to be as self-sufficient as possible, so these massive plantations would produce enough of their own food, and they would buy their other supplies, their clothing and other supplies from Europe or the North. They weren't buying anything locally. So this is going to mean that your southern towns at this time, unless they were one of the few big coastal cities or Atlanta, most of the southern towns are going to be these little tiny, kind of shack towns of a few small wood buildings, and you just have a very rural population that's spread out. These planters are going to get tutors for their own kids. They're not going to invest in public schools. They don't need a lot of roads, so they're not going to invest in the transportation improvements that we talked about last time that happened so dramatically in the North and really transform the North economically. So they're not making any investment. They're not buying things from locals. They're not investing infrastructure educationally in locals. They're just kind of taking care of themselves. And yet, instead of being resented, the white majority sees them as the role model or the rock star. And now you might say, how could this possibly be? Well, essentially, what you have happening is, this white majority has the dream of owning and becoming a rock star themselves. Now, early on, maybe it's kind of like, in the 1970s, oddly, you had an eclectic variety of new businesses that emerged out of people's garages or things. Phil Knight starts Nike, selling shoes out of the trunk of his car, driving from track meet to track meet. You have computer companies like Microsoft that are going to be started in somebody's garage by Bill Gates and Paul Allen. And all kinds of stories of people like this that they kind of got ahead of the curve, but they started basically with just some know-how and no money. Now, how hard would it be to get into the athletic shoe industry? Now, how hard would it be to get into the computer industry? Okay? Very, very difficult, I would think. Now, Under Armour truly has emerged in the last 15 years or so as kind of a new athletic force in apparel and footwear, but there were a lot of special circumstances to that also, and that person who started generated a tremendous amount of seed money before they started the company to get going and then got some investors. It's really hard. Imagine trying to enter from scratch the computer industry today. Yes, you could make an app. Can you start being a producer of computers? That's more difficult, okay? That's a little bit more challenging. You can make an app or a software program that's cool, but making a whole computer, a little bit more difficult. So anyhow, there's this dream of owning slaves, improving themselves, and entering this upper level of society. It's very unrealistic and not going to happen because as land gets spread out into the West, a lot of this land, like in Mississippi, is swampland. Or in Florida, it has to be cleared. Well, who's going to clear it? You need to have a huge amount of slaves to do this work clearing jungle areas, basically, and making them into kind of fertile wetlands for cotton production. So the white majority gets almost nothing. They have poor health. They have poor nutrition, they have poor education, they have poor infrastructure to rely on, and yet they totally cling to this because they're told, you're better than these slaves. You're better, you're white. And so you can kind of see how eventually you get these ideas of white supremacy because this is how they get their support, is tell them, well, you could be like us someday and hold that dream out there, give them a little hope, but at the same time they're just saying, well, you're superior too because of your skin color. Now you have another group, the mountain whites, that are looked down on even more. The Appalachian Mountains, of course, are coming right through here, okay? And as the Appalachian Mountains come through here, you have a part of the population that settles in there, and it's a mountainous region. They're not growing cotton or tobacco. There's no plantations. They have no slaves. They have no commitment to slavery. They generally don't like slaves a lot, but they really also do not like the planter class, and they're just kind of separate. They don't want to be a part of that. So the mountain whites are essentially kind of just on their own. And what you're going to see, the mountain whites in what becomes West Virginia eventually secede in the Civil War. You're going to see large amounts of mountain whites come from this area in the Appalachians and go and fight for the North because they believe in the Union and they have no commitment to slavery or the Southern cause. All right, free blacks. So obviously, with the racism going on, free blacks are going to be seen as lower than any white, and yet some of these people were former slaves. They had been freed, or maybe they bought their own freedom because they had gotten technical skills, and sometimes slaves would work overtime on their own so that they could save up money and buy their freedom. Okay, so that could happen. So you had free blacks in different parts, especially in places like New Orleans. There were a lot, but generally, as you would expect, there's going to be more free blacks the farther north you go than there are going to be in the deep south, outside of maybe New Orleans, which had kind of a specific, unusual situation. And of course, at the very bottom, you have slaves. Now, slaves, you'll hear more about this in the podcast, but essentially, slaves are given a couple of very, very minor sets of clothes, and they're given kind of some little cabin that is, of course, not heated or very weather protected. And Southern owners looked at it as they need enough food, shelter, and clothing to stay healthy because they had a big money investment in slaves. But beyond that, they're going to give them a few personal allowances, looking the other way when they kind of informally marry and things like that at times. To just basically, allowing them to kind of have kinship networks with other slaves at the plantations. But this is all just kind of something so they don't just totally rebel against them. And so what you see here, you do have 5 different levels of Southern society. You have 3 different commitments to slavery and climate and industries, or I guess kind of commercial ventures. And then we talked earlier about our essential question. So that's all the time we have for today. Stay classy, San Barlow.